Perched upon a reclusive hilltop overlooking the nearby Arthur Kill, stands an ornately detailed home of Victorian design. Built in 1884, the impressive structure can still be seen resting amidst an overgrown landscape, a slumbering sentinel barely 1,000 feet from the shores of a tidal strait that separates Staten Island from mainland New Jersey. Urban sprawl continues to encroach upon its boundaries, and it looks oddly out of place within the sea of progress rising on all sides. Today, one would be hard-pressed to imagine its short-lived existence as an upscale Italian restaurant. But so too would one struggle to consider the secrets held within its walls. Secrets of a far more disturbing nature than merely a failed eatery. This intriguing structure, known as the Kreischer Mansion, is a fine example of Victorian architecture that is exemplified by the asymmetrical design of its most prominent feature, a three-story polygonal tower that dominates the landscape and casts an imposing silhouette to any and all who may cross its shadow. In recent years, the mansion's upper-floor windows are devoid of any drapery, and those that do remain hang like tarnished mirrors reflecting the solemnness within. Through their empty rumination, one can easily recognize the premises as vacant. In all actuality, it has been for some time, but this hasn't always been the case. In fact, barely 2 decades ago, the mansion was the site of a bustling and popular restaurant called the Kreischer House. The Kreischer House was at one time an upscale Italian restaurant owned and operated by Joseph and Andrea McBratney. To the entrepreneurial young couple, it appeared as if every aspect of the mansion's unique design was remarkably well-suited to fulfill their aspirations to open their dream establishment. The surrounding 4.5 acres of undeveloped land would provide ample parking and space to host a variety of special events, while the ornate veranda that partially wraps the home's footprint could comfortably seat 50+ for outdoor dining. No expense was spared in the mansion's conversion into the high-end establishment the McBratneys envisioned. Industrial-sized hoods, commercial-grade ovens, and appliances were set within a completely remodeled kitchen, including a large walk-in freezer that had been installed in the basement. Every detail had been taken into consideration, including an expansive bar and a cigar room for patrons to enjoy a smoke and a cordial. The end result was exceptionally unique in every aspect. In 1996, the Kreischer House opened for business amidst much excitement and high expectations. The exceptional quality of their Italian fare was an instant hit with patrons. The mussels, in particular, were loudly proclaimed as some of the best to be had on the island. However, in more hushed tones, patrons and staff soon began whispering of strange occurrences taking place within the mansion. The exact source of the inexplicable and often alarming incidents that transpired within its aging walls would forever be food for speculation. Conjecture or otherwise, the history of both the mansion and grounds were steeped in tragedy and misfortune. In fact, the sole reason for the historic structure's very existence began with a spark within a warehouse at 25 Merchant Street in Lower Manhattan that occurred on the 16th of December, 1835. It was an unusually cold day even for December. The streets of New York were blanketed in a thick layer of snow that was blown about like icy sheets of frozen shrapnel by gale-force winds. Once the ignition occurred, the mounting flames roared throughout the warehouse and rapidly spread out of control. Fueled by high winds that exacerbated an already tenuous situation, the fire was unmanageable right from the start. Although several advancements had been made since the bucket brigade days, firefighting technology during the 1830s could be described as inadequate at best. To make matters worse, the dreadful conditions that faced the firefighters at the hands of the pummeling winds were worsened by the sub-freezing temperatures that rendered all nearby water sources frozen and inaccessible. And considering that during this era, New York City contained mainly wood-frame structures, conditions were ripe for disaster. As building after building succumbed to the fire's wrath, firefighters frantically hacked away at the frozen East River and began pumping water through their hoses. Unfortunately, almost as soon as the frigid water began to flow through their lines, it ebbed to a trickle and emerged as nothing more than a slushy mess. Quickly running out of options, it was decided that the only way to avert complete destruction was to collapse a number of buildings in the fire's path with the use of gunpowder. Thankfully, enough buildings were cleared to prohibit further calamity. Even so, the damage was extraordinary. By the time the fire had finally burned itself out some 15 hours later, over 600 buildings and businesses were destroyed. The losses totaled over $20 million, today's equivalent of over $500 million. Those 15 hours of havoc brought the city to its collective knees, and recovery would entail many changes. Enter Balthasar Kreischer. Balthasar Kreischer was born on the 13th of January 1813 in Hornbach, Bavaria. As a young man, he toiled in the family business while acquiring a diverse set of skills across a number of trades. While his young hands bore the scars of brickmaking and stone cutting, his spirit was that of an entrepreneur who aptly recognized the opportunity that lay across the Atlantic in the Great Fire's aftermath. Kreischer immigrated to New York in 1836 as the great city sought to find its footing amid a chaotic barrage of plans to rebuild in the wake of the recent devastation. The 23-year-old Bavarian wasted little time and dove headlong into the fray. By 1845, he co-founded a brickworks company at the corner of Girk and Delancey Streets in Manhattan called Kreischer and Mumpeton. The company became major players in the rebuilding of New York City and were soon amassing a small fortune by provisioning hungry developers with a steady supply of bricks fired from their New Jersey clay pits located across the Hudson River. Following the death of Charles Mumpeton 4 years later, Kreischer saw yet another opportunity to expand his brick manufacturing empire and unveiled the new family business, Kreischer and Company. Around the same time, he also discovered a Staten Island quarry rich in white kaolin clay, from which he could craft his bricks from a material far more fire-resistant than the red clay bricks his company had been manufacturing. He purchased the land, and in 1855, Kreischer's first Staten Island factory was erected. The factory, located in the Androvettville section of the island, quickly expanded to a sprawling 700 acres. At its peak, it manufactured 3.5 million bricks per year. More impressively, the plant also employed over 300 factory workers and quarrymen who had come to settle within this once nondescript and remote section of the borough. Balthasar Kreischer recognized the needs of his workers while they assimilated to the rigors of the industry. He was compelled to care for their families in a manner that would keep them content to stay within his employ. Additionally, he elected to do all he could to attract the kind of worker that could commit to the success of his company over the long haul, and began by constructing a row of workers' homes along a nearby street that now bears his name. So much economic and cultural impact had the brick manufacturer made upon the area that the Staten Island neighborhood of Androvettville was soon renamed Kreischerville. Within clear sight of the brick manufacturing facility that bore his family's name, Kreischer built a mansion for he and his lovely wife Carolyn to raise a family. Together, they had 7 children, including 3 sons named George, Charles, and Edward. Each of the 3 would eventually enter the family business by order of birth. The eldest, George, could be deemed an inventor of sorts, and he became increasingly involved with the gas lighting and steam-powered transportation industries. While making his home in New York City, he would remain a constant within the family business throughout the majority of his lifetime. And while both his brothers would be fully immersed in the family business by 1878, their individual paths to a similar destination would be remarkably different. For instance, Charles immediately immersed himself in the family business and excelled in every aspect, eventually ascending to plant superintendent. All outward impressions would imply that Charles reveled in his position and the stability it afforded his family. However, that was not quite the case. Charles proved to be a young man of high aspirations and conviction, and stood firm in the belief that any success attained would have to be earned by his own hand. Eventually, he struck out on his own to run the New York Anderson Pressed brick factory and ultimately ventured off to Europe to broaden his horizons. Conversely, his younger brother Edward began his ascension into the workforce by resisting all attempts of steady employment at his father's Kreischerville factory. Instead, he found work at Steinway & Sons before moving into a management position at the Staten Island Railway. However, his reluctance to join the family business was short-lived, and he eventually found himself working beside his brothers at the brick manufacturing plant along the shores of the Arthur Kill. Success came easy to the Kreischers. The brick business boomed and their wealth grew, but it would not go on indefinitely. In fact, the first seedlings of the misfortune the family would come to know began on New Year's Day in 1877 when the factory ironically burned down to the ground. Undeterred by the temporary setback, the facility was quickly reconstructed. The year 1878 saw many changes, not the least of which was the retirement of Balthasar Kreischer. The 65-year-old decided to spend his remaining years enjoying the fruits of his labors. Watching from his lair, he took immense pride in the manner in which his three sons worked diligently to keep the family business a profitable endeavor. In 1884, he built 2 mansions on an empty hill that stood just behind the family home. Since his eldest son, George, resided in a home of his own in Manhattan, the 2 residences were built for each of Kreischer's younger sons, Charles and Edward. The homes stood barely 100 yards apart from one another on the crest of a grassy knoll that shared the very same view of the Arthur Kill and the brickworks below. They were of identical design, less one significant feature. They were reversed to provide the perfect mirror image to one another. Perhaps this was done to juxtapose the similarities and the differences between the 2 sons, or perhaps it was merely done as an ostentatious show of wealth. Either way, the point could not be missed. The Kreischers were indeed the center of the community's orbit, and their sphere of influence was unquestionable. It may have been a good time to be a Kreischer, but the recurring theme of loss would soon rear its ugly head yet again. The family's steady decline of fortunes began with the death of Balthasar Kreischer on the 25th of August, 1886. It was a blow to all, and many questioned the future of the brick manufacturing plant without its founder. In 1891, Charles decided to once and for all leave his position as superintendent and travel abroad to seek his fortune. A year later came yet another blow when the factory caught fire for the second time in 14 years. This time, however, the destruction was complete. With hundreds left unemployed, Edward spent thousands of dollars of his own money helping support the families of his employees, as opposed to chancing the loss of his workforce. The downward spiral continued as Edward and George navigated the demoralized spirits of their employees, dwindling finances and escalating expenditures, all of which contributed to a series of disputes between the remaining brothers. The morning of the 8th of June, 1894 was one of pristine beauty. The low humidity would result in a most pleasant 73-degree day filled with enough sunshine to brighten the foulest of moods. By any measuring stick, it was idyllic in every aspect. Later reports would indicate that even Edward Kreischer had left his home in a noticeably cheerful state of mind, a seemingly rare occurrence at this point in his life. He arrived at the factory bearing a bright countenance, and the departure from his typically sullen appearance was hard to ignore. He made his way towards the waterfront and was witnessed leaving the wharf at approximately 9:15 a.m. The youngest of Kreischer's sons was not seen again until 9:45. This time, lifeless and cold with a gunshot wound to his head and a revolver in close proximity to his hand. Although there were a few who tended to disagree with the official investigation, foul play was ruled out by authorities and the case deemed a suicide. With Edward's demise, the series of misfortunes that would come to plague everything connected with the Kreischer Empire seemed to escalate. Tired, beat down, and perhaps too haunted by recent demons, the 53-year-old George Kreischer sold the factory and family estates, thus effectively terminating his family's existence in Kreischerville. The 20th century dawned as had the promise of many new technologies. The automobile, the miracle of flight, and advanced mechanics were just a few that could propel humanity to new heights. Instead, these advancements were exploited for human suffering in the form of the First World War. And by the late teens, the carnage the Great War had inflicted upon humanity escalated dramatically, and with it, anti-German sentiment. So much had these feelings permeated the home front that the neighborhood of Kreischerville was officially changed to Charleston. The end of World War I may have led to a period of economic prosperity for many, but the decade did little to reinforce the fortunes of the newly dubbed town of Charleston. In fact, the thriving brick manufacturing plant that once was considered the lifeblood of so many families went belly up and ceased operations in 1927. Employees who had once called Kreischerville home packed up in droves and left for greener pastures. Boarded up and desolate, the plant was demolished in 1936. Shortly after the factory was razed, the former mansion of Balthasar Kreischer met the same fate. And as if to put an exclamation point on the property's spiraling descent, yet another victim was claimed by flames. This time, the former residence of the deceased, Edward Kreischer. By 1940, the Charles Kreischer mansion was the lone survivor upon a barren hilltop. In retrospect, there had been much speculation of a dark nature that seems to have surrounded the history of the Charles Kreischer mansion. Disturbing conjecture spoken in hushed whispers, such as the alleged demise of a former cook who hung himself within the residence. And even more troubling were the persistent rumors of child abuse having transpired within the home. And it didn't end with the departure of the Kreischers. Dr. Greenfield, the mansion's next owner, was mysteriously found dead in the living room. No cause, no reason, just dead. While the mansion was given landmark status in 1968, it was relegated to a lonely existence amongst a landscape filled with decaying memories of yesteryear. Tired and empty, it remained an aging relic, lost in a haze of myth, legend, and speculation for close to 30 years. That is, until an energetic young couple named Joseph and Andrea McBratney moved in with their restaurant. By all estimations, the festive and lively atmosphere of a successful restaurant could be seen as the perfect remedy to alleviate the residence's controversial past and inject life into its numbed spirit. And in most cases, that would be the case. However, within the walls of the Charles Kreischer mansion, it was not to be. Joseph McBratney may have lacked experience in the restaurant industry, but he had drive, determination, and spirit. There was also another attribute he possessed that most would not expect, a dark family secret he did not often speak of. It seems the young restaurateur was, in fact, the son of Irish-American gangster James McBratney. During the early 1970s, the elder McBratney was suspected to have engaged in a string of kidnappings that included the nephew of mafia kingpin Carlo Gambino. In the world of organized crime, this was obviously a transgression that could not go unpunished. On the 22nd of May 1973, McBratney sat on a stool within a Staten Island bar and grill named Snoopy's when three men dressed as cops entered the tavern. McBratney looked up from his seat, and he suddenly found himself at the wrong end of a revolver. 3 shots to the brain, and a young wise guy named John Gotti made his bones while solidifying his reputation within the Gambino crime family, while James McBratney died in a pool of blood. After his father's murder, Joe McBratney may have kept his distance from organized crime, but the same cannot be said for the mob presence on Staten Island. In fact, perhaps the greatest irony of all is that FBI files claim that McBratney's Kreischer House restaurant was the site of several covert meetings between Bonanno and Gambino crime family members during 1998. It seems mobsters were not the only visitors frequenting the premises of McBratney's establishment in the late 90s. Employees and patrons continued to report a number of unexplained incidents in the restaurant. Noises, voices, and otherworldly sightings were not unusual occurrences, particularly in the basement area of the restaurant. Mob figures and ghouls aside, the restaurant was only open a few years before it was reputed to have come into financial straits and ultimately closed. And in light of what was to come, I wish that I could say, so ends the tale of the Kreischer House. Sadly, it does not. In fact, the events that would come to transpire within the walls of the old mansion would make anything that had come before pale in comparison. After the restaurant had closed, the Kreischer mansion had sat empty for a short time. Musician George Harrison considered purchasing it, quite taken with its historic elegance. But while he contemplated the purchase, he was attacked in his Henley-on-Thames home and stabbed in the chest by a disturbed intruder. Thus ended the former Beatles' interest in the Kreischer mansion, citing it as not secure enough to suit his needs. Instead, the property was purchased by Ohio developer Isaac Yomtovian in 1999. While planning to develop the surrounding grounds, Yomtovian set about restoring the Kreischer mansion to its original glory. During the restoration, the developer hired a former Marine named Joseph Young to act as the property's caretaker, allowing him to live in the mansion while employed. Following the renovation, a sudden increase in the cost of heating the mansion was of concern because it exceeded that of mere inflation. An HVAC expert was called in, and his recommendation was the old furnace be replaced along with a complete overhaul of the duct system, which appeared to be clogged. The work was completed, and some time would pass before the furnace would again come up for discussion. That occurred in 2007 when Yomtovian was served with an FBI search warrant in regards to a murder investigation. Their interest was the home and its contents, including the furnace, septic system, and outbuildings. And although the furnace had previously been removed, detectives still found enough evidence to pique their interest. They returned again in 2008. This time, their search was centered about dredging the waters of a nearby wharfside restaurant. The search proved fruitful, and they recovered a steel pole believed to be used to stoke the fire in the since-removed furnace. The evidence gathered between these two investigations was enough to eventually convict Joseph Young on a murder rap and award him with a life sentence for his efforts. And the details of the murder are as unexpected as they are grisly. Robert McKelvey was a local auto mechanic who dabbled as a small-time hood within the crew of Bonanno crime family member Gino Galestro. Galestro, a made guy, had recently been approached by his underling with the request to settle some trouble McKelvey was having in regard to the mortgage on his home. The problem was remedied, but evidently not to McKelvey's satisfaction, and he squawked openly about it to anyone who'd listen. There was little room in the business for disrespect, and even less for those with loose lips. Galestro had finally had enough and decided McKelvey had to go. In March 2005, Galestro reached out to another associate within his crew named Joseph Young, who was referred to by his peers as Joe Black. Young was an ex-Marine who specialized in arson, robbery, and gun trafficking. Galestro offered Young $10,000 to dispose of McKelvey, and he accepted. Galestro tagged his second-in-command, Mike Sonny Maggio, to oversee the hit and make sure it went off without a hitch. Together, Young and Maggio decided to bring two additional associates within the Galestro crew, Stefan Sicale and Jose Garcia, into the fold. Later that month, the wheels of the deadly plan were set in motion. Maggio was to lure McKelvey to the mansion, while Joe Young lay in wait within the shadows of the old home, and Sicale and Garcia sat in a nearby go-go bar awaiting the call they were told would come. From inside, Young heard the wheels of Maggio's black Chrysler 300 spit out morsels of gravel and slide to a stop in the driveway. He also heard the two men step out of the car and slam the doors behind them. The mansion was but a shadow against the dark sky, and whether or not its foreboding presence in the fading light preyed upon McKelvey's sense of caution is something that will never be known. Maggio and McKelvey climbed the wooden stairs and stood momentarily on the porch. Maggio moved forward and almost imperceptibly paused but an instant to gaze at the embellished transom that resided above the front door. His focus regained, he turned the knob and entered the stillness within. McKelvey followed. As they stepped into the unlit hallway, Joseph Young suddenly leapt from the shadows and plunged a knife deep into McKelvey's side. Disoriented in the darkness, McKelvey had no sooner realized the painful reality of what was transpiring when he felt Young's hands circle his throat and begin to apply pressure. Gurgling sounds filled the hallway as McKelvey clawed at the doorway, begging for precious air to fill his lungs. Refusing to go down without a fight, he somehow broke free from his aggressor and staggered outside onto the porch and down the same stairs he ascended only moments earlier, clutching his wound and gasping for air. Young, rife with adrenaline, burst through the door with the ferocity of a linebacker and gave chase. He lunged upon his victim mere paces from the staircase, and McKelvey collapsed beneath his weight. Tiring of the struggle and determined to dispatch his quarry as quickly and efficiently as possible, the former Marine grabbed the injured McKelvey by the collar and dragged him to the edge of a small ornamental pond a few yards away. In a fit of rage, he clutched McKelvey's head and submerged his face beneath the water. In moments, the struggle was over. Young stood a moment and glared at his handiwork. He then pulled McKelvey's wet, lifeless body from the pond and dragged it across the yard into a dilapidated shed. There, he stripped McKelvey, while Maggio placed a call to Sicali and Garcia with a direct order to come to the mansion. Minutes later, Sicali, Garcia, and Maggio stood in the shed discussing the best manner to dispose of the body. Joseph Young walked in and stated that he'd burned McKelvey's clothes in the basement's furnace. Maggio smiled and decided McKelvey would meet the same fate. But before that, they had to create an alibi for their whereabouts. The foursome made haste to a local establishment called Frescas on the Bay. They ate, laughed, and made certain nothing appeared to be out of the ordinary in the eyes of the surveillance cameras. Satisfied their alibi was solid, they left and stopped at Home Depot on Forest Avenue to purchase some masks, bags, gloves, drop cloths, and a few hacksaws. About midnight, they made their way back to the mansion. They entered the shed and found McKelvey's naked body just as they had left it. They pulled one bag over his lower half, another over his upper half, and taped the bagged corpse to a long wooden shutter they utilized as a makeshift gurney to transport McKelvey from the shed to the house. Once inside, Young grabbed a mattress and set it on the floor of the kitchen. McKelvey was cut from the shutter and placed on the mattress. The four men took turns dismembering the corpse. The body parts were double-bagged and brought to the basement. And over the course of the next several hours, they fed McKelvey's disturbed corpse into the basement's furnace, often having to use a metal bar to poke the body parts to keep them burning. Stefan Sicali went as far as to complain during court testimony that the grisly process of burning McKelvey's remains emitted a terrible smell. Ironically, the recurring theme of fire had surfaced yet again. In the months to follow, the perpetrators of the grisly crime experienced misfortune not unlike others who had become too intimate with the mansion. Joseph Young was sentenced to life in prison in 2009 for the murder of Robert McKelvey. After pleading guilty to racketeering charges and ordering the murder of McKelvey, Gino Galestro was given 20 years in prison and was released in June 2022. Sonny Maggio became a cooperating witness in the case and was given a 6-year sentence for his part in the crime, while Stefan Sicali became the government's key witness against Joe Young, and a formal guilty plea earned him a sentence of time served after 4.5 years of incarceration. And as if to put an exclamation point on the entire affair, Frank Fresca, owner of Frescas on the Bay, where the foursome congregated for the purpose of an alibi, was murdered in front of his restaurant by an unidentified assailant who fired 9 .22 caliber rounds into his body. Today, the Charles Kreischer mansion sits starkly upon the hill on which it was erected, gazing silently upon a history of its own creation, that of an embittered existence built upon the flames of opportunity. Its spirit is intertwined with both fortune and misfortune, and its aural wake bears the essence of an array of experiences and visitors: entrepreneurs, tradesmen, restaurateurs, gangsters, mobsters, spirits, hauntings, mysterious deaths, suicide, murder, dismemberment, and even a beetle, all of whom had been touched by its presence in one way or another. Within the neighborhood formerly known as Kreischerville, the past is receding rapidly. The home that once played such an integral part of the community now bears a fate that is still undetermined. And if its exorbitant price tag, coupled with its prohibitive landmark status, isn't enough to scare a prospective buyer away, Perhaps a few of the spooks will. Even so, I hear it would be a terrific spot for a restaurant.
If you like this content and would like to see more of the same, please click subscribe and feel free to leave me a comment if you have an infamous eatery you'd like to see covered.